What's going on, guys? This is everything you need to know about the GPP scores, the GPP Scores Primer, if you will. And if you haven't heard of the GPP scores, I should say, if you're here, chances are you already have heard about the GPP scores through PGA DFS, through MLB DFS. And if you haven't heard of them, fear not, we're going to cover everything here. But basically, we created the GPP scores for PGA DFS this season. They were so successful from day one that we said, okay, we've got to build them for MLB DFS as well. And again, they were so successful so early on that now the GPP scores are just kind of synonymous with the FTN DFS product as a whole. So, of course, we have them for the NFL season as well. So, this conversation is going to boil down to three different questions. What are the GPP scores telling us? Why are the GPP scores so effective? And how do we use the GPP scores to build winning lineups? And so, where we're going to start this conversation is, what do they actually tell us? What do the GPP scores tell us? And as complex as the math behind these scores are, the answer to this question is actually quite simple. A positive GPP score means the player is underowned, and we should heavily consider using the player. A negative GPP score means he's overowned. We should consider fading the player. For those unfamiliar with the term fade in DFS, it's when you purposely avoid a player. And so, like every slate, there are so many different guys. Obviously, you can't fit everybody into your lineup, especially if you're like me and you typically run just one lineup per week. There are going to be a lot of guys that you had interest in that don't make it to your lineup. I don't consider that fading a player. What I consider fading a player is I look at this guy and I am not just avoiding this guy, but potentially even trying to leverage everybody who is playing that guy. We'll get into that conversation a little bit. So a little bit on what it means to be underowned, overowned, and how we calculate that. One of the main reasons why we came up with the GPP scores in the first place is because DFS is complex. When evaluating a play in DFS, it's not like fantasy football where it's just how well do I think this guy is going to do today. We have to consider the guy's price, his projection, his projected ownership. And those three are kind of just the bare minimum of what we need to consider. We also want to consider the full range of outcomes. So how high is this player's ceiling? How likely is he to reach that ceiling or at least come close to it? Which, that's, if you were listening carefully there are two very distinct ways in which we want to think about the ceiling for a player, and then also how likely the player is to fail. And again, that's an awful lot to think of. And so the purpose of the GPP scores is to take all of that data into consideration, spit out just one number that you can use to guide your lineup building process. And so essentially, when we say that a player is underowned, what we're doing is, number one, finding a target ownership for the guy. And you can think of this as, this is what his efficient ownership would be. Then if the projected ownership is above that target ownership, in other words, we think he should be 15%, but he's projected at 25%, then we're saying, okay, this guy is overowned and we don't want to use this player. If we think he should be 25%, he's projected at 15%. Okay, now his projected ownership is less than his target ownership. He has a positive GPP score. He's underowned. Now, once you have either a positive GPP score or a negative GPP score, that GPP score can either go up and make the guy a fantastic play, one of the best GPP scores on the slate, or it can go way down. So the two ways in which a player's GPP score goes higher is, number one, pretty straightforward. The difference between his target ownership and his projected ownership increases. So, if there are two guys projected at 15% and we think one should be at 20% and the other should be at 25%, the guy whose target ownership and projected ownership are 10 percentage points different, that's the guy who's going to have the higher GPP score. He's more underowned than the other guy. The second way in which a GPP score can go up is simply if his ceiling, if his odds of smashing, which we have defined in the past as helping your lineup, increasing your lineup's chances of getting a takedown in any GPP tournament. And so it's not just, paying off the price tag. It's not necessarily just being the top scorer at the position on a slate. Travis Kelce could get you 15 points, be the highest scoring tight end, and you could be better off with any really cheap guy at like 8 DraftKings points, right? And similarly, there's going to be another slate where maybe he's third in DraftKings points, but he scored you 30, and it's just somebody else got 31 and someone else got 32. He's going to be more helpful scoring that 30 and the third highest scorer. than the highest score at 15 points. And so we're capturing all of that in our definition of smash and our definition of ceiling. Behind the scenes, we're not going to go too into the math of that. It's not quite like PGA where those finishes are a little bit more defined, like failure in PGA, you have a miscut. There's no exact comparison for the NFL, but we have put in very careful consideration into our definitions of failing and our definitions of success for these guys that go into the GPP score. So that covers how a GPP score goes higher. So again, the higher the GPP score, the better the play. Similarly, a negative GPP score becomes even more negative if, you guessed it, his projected ownership and target ownership are wider apart. If a guy should be 15%, but is 20%, it's going to be a small negative number. If he should be 15% and he's 35%, that's going to be a big negative number. And the second thing that can increase, or I should say decrease, a negative GPP score is just he's more likely to fail. So, you're going to have some guys where, he's got a 40% chance of failing. Whereas, maybe a Tyreek Hill, for example, if we think he's overowned, well, even if he's overowned, the likelihood that Tyreek Hill actually fails on any given slate is pretty low. So his GPP score is likely never to get super, super negative. But maybe I shouldn't speak too soon. We don't have the GPP scores yet for week 1. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they're like. But that pretty much covers what GPP scores tell us. Is the player underowned? Is he overowned? We'll get into exactly, how we make decisions then in our lineup based on what the GPP score is for each player. But that's what the GPP scores tell us. And the last thing I'll say here before we move on to why they're so effective is that these GPP scores, the target ownerships, are slate specific to a degree, but they're not fully slate specific. So the ways in which they are slate specific, they react to the size of the slate and they react to who's on the slate. So for example, CeeDee Lamb is going to have a lower target ownership on slates in which Tyreek Hill is also playing because his likelihood of being the highest scorer go down if Tyreek Hill is also on the slate, things of that nature. But what it can't kind of capture is what value exists on a slate. So sometimes you'll see slates where a lot of the really expensive options, even if they project really well, all have great GPP scores. And it's not because people are underrating them. It's because people don't have the value to play all the expensive guys that they want. And so even then, the GPP scores kind of tell us a story about what people are doing in their lineups. And so they're still helpful there. And so one of the things that I look for, and again, we'll get to this in the final section of how to use the GPP scores, but it's not necessarily just how high the GPP score is. It's also, is he separating from everybody else at his position and everybody else in his price tier? So with that, let's go to how are the GPP scores so effective? I think there are two answers to this question that really get at the heart of it. And the first is, I have built metrics in the past that did a really good job of helping us find the diamonds in the rough, the under-owned guys, the low-owned guys who have a real chance of breaking the slate. The problem with all those metrics were that they failed the test then of separating good chalk from bad chalk. It was really difficult to kind of toe the line there where, maybe you are building a metric that rewards low ownership and penalizes high ownership. But if it's always penalizing high ownership, then it's always also penalizing the guys who deserve to be super high owned. The GPP scores are super effective because they are equivalently effective at separating good chalk from bad chalk as they are from finding those diamonds in the rough, the GPP winners, the guys who break the slate at low ownership. So that's number one. And then number two is that they do a really good job of helping us understand something that I think our intuition fails at, which is a lot of the time, takedowns are not just about who we play, but also about who we don't play. And so when I think of my best NFL weeks, the biggest takedowns that I've had in NFL, it's not just that my guys have done really well. It's also that the chalk that I've faded has failed. And so I think, a lot of the time in the past, I've done a very good, purposeful job of fading that chalk and doing it in a purposeful way. Like a couple of years ago, that Tony Pollard week when the Cowboys played the Vikings and Pollard had 2 long touchdown receptions. That week, we called Tony Pollard week. And CeeDee Lamb and Dalton Schultz were the most popular wide receiver and tight end on the slate. And obviously, Pollard's long touchdowns weren't just great for Pollard in our lineups. It was also great because it meant that Lamb and Schultz had complete drives wasted. Both of those guys failed at really high ownership when Pollard smashed. And all of us at FTN really went to the top of leaderboards. So that was an instance where we did a very good, purposeful job. But then there have been other times where I've kind of gotten lucky that the chalk that I wasn't on just didn't come through. And that's, I think, that's been the biggest takeaway for me from these GPP scores, is that whenever we choose to play a guy at high ownership, we can say to ourselves, hey, I'm not relying on this guy to win me the slate. I know that he's not going to be low owned, so I don't really care if he's 40% or 60% or 80%. And in that regard, it's not that we're wrong in saying that for the effect that the player has in our lineup, but we're then missing the fact that he can have an effect outside of our lineup as well. And so if you think about a guy being 40% and failing when you don't have him in your lineup, it's very similar to having a 60% guy in your lineup who does really well. And you would say, okay, because this guy's 60%, I gained an advantage over 40 people or 40% of the field. That's good. But now imagine instead the guy is 80% owned and you fade him. Now, obviously, it's the equivalent of having a 20% guy in your lineup who does really well. You're gaining an advantage over 80% of the field. That's a much, much larger piece of the pie. And so the big takeaway for me from these GPP scores, in addition to just doing a really good job with good chalk and bad chalk, and obviously finding the low-owned guys, it's helped me view the slate in a better way and understanding that every time we play a chalky guy, we're missing out on the potential to leverage the field if he does poorly. I think it's a really key point, and it's been a really, really impactful kind of way of looking at slates, particularly in PGA DFS for me this year, but absolutely it's true in NFL DFS as well. And it's going to get to one of my favorite concepts, which we'll get to in the how to use the GPP score section. So with that, in fact, we might as well go right to that. And so what I was getting at there is that NFL is so awesome because a lot of the time the chalk will fail in a very predictable way. It's almost like we can say, hey, this guy's probably going to do really well, but I know that if he doesn't, it's because of this, it's because of that. And so when we are fading guys, think of that CeeDee Lamb and Dalton Schultz example that I gave earlier. We knew, hey, if they fail, it's probably because somebody else is really producing instead. They were never going to have a terrible game against the Vikings that week. It was just that somebody else had the production, and somebody else had the production on explosive plays, which kept them off the field. And so we were able to fade Lamb and Schultz by going to Pollard. You do that kind of thing a lot in NFL DFS. We like to call it correlated leverage. When the contrarian guy we're pivoting to is inversely correlated with the chalky player we're pivoting off of. So something to keep in mind. Yet another reason why the GPP scores will be fantastic. In fact, I got one question on that already, like how the GPP scores can help us find correlated leverage. It's pretty straightforward. You find the guy with the worst GPP score and you say, all right, if he fails, who benefits? Boom. And hopefully there will be times where, like in this instance, maybe CeeDee Lamb has the worst GPP score. And so you can say, all right, now obviously it's not going to be Pollard anymore because he's no longer on the Cowboys, but maybe it's, Calvin Ridley who has a really bad GPP score. And DeAndre Hopkins has a pretty good GPP score. Okay, that's an easy pivot, right? It's not always going to be that straightforward, but a lot of the time it will be. So very much looking forward to that. One other thing I'll say here, we kind of alluded to this earlier, but imagine a scenario where Josh Allen, Dalton Kincaid, and CeeDee Lamb all have great GPP scores in week one. Again, we don't have the GPP scores yet, so I'm just making this up to hold me to those numbers, but just imagine a scenario where that's the case. So you start to try and build a lineup that has all three, and you notice, hey, you know what? I don't really have the savings anywhere to make this work. I have to choose between Lamb or that pairing of Josh Allen and Dalton Kincaid. So what can we look for to figure out which of the two we want? Yeah, you can look at the size of the GPP scores themselves. Maybe Lamb has a fantastic one and it's just better. That can work. But the other thing you can do is you can look at what's available at those other positions. So maybe there are cheaper quarterbacks with GPP scores every bit as good as Josh Allen's. Maybe there are, a handful of wide receivers under $6,000 with great GPP scores as well. Okay, in that case, maybe you don't want the quarterback. Maybe you don't want the receiver. But what if Dalton Kincaid is the only tight end with a really strong GPP score? Maybe there are a couple others slightly positive, but Dalton Kincaid's is one of the best on the slate. Okay, maybe he should be prioritized. And if you're prioritizing him, then it makes sense to get the correlation with Josh Allen. So you can use the GPP scores that way. But that discussion is kind of all about the individual play. And the final piece of the puzzle here is how do we use GPP scores to help us stack? How do we help select stacks as a whole and not just individual players? And so obviously, there are going to be weeks where it's really simple, right? Quarterback is going to have a great GPP score. His wide receiver one's going to have a great GPP score, maybe even his tight end or an opposing receiver in the game. And we've got just a perfect double stack or a perfect game stack just right there in front of us from the GPP scores. Those weeks are going to be great. They're not going to be there every single time. And so how do we make the decision when a quarterback has a great GPP score, but none of his receiving options do? Or a receiver has a great GPP score, but his quarterback doesn't? How do we make the stack decisions on those guys? So the first example that I'll give, because I think it might happen in week one, Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson has slate-breaking rushing upside, but a lot of the time when he actually breaks the slate, it's going to be because he doesn't just have that rushing production. He also has a good game through the air. So if he has a great GPP score and Michael Pittman doesn't and Josh Downs doesn't, none of those guys do, we can still stack him because we're saying Richardson is worth it. And in order to truly unlock his ceiling, to give him that true slate-breaking upside, he's probably going to carry along one of his receiving options. It doesn't have to be Pittman, doesn't have to be Downs. In fact, you can almost then use that as license to build the rest of your lineup and choose the stack partner last. That could work. Maybe you're just punting tight end with Kylen Granson, something like that, right? On the flip side, maybe Jamar Chase has a great GPP score. Well, if Burrow doesn't have a great one, that might just tell you, okay, he doesn't have the upside because of the rushing, where Chase can absolutely smash while Burrow isn't the guy that I need. And so maybe you want to go find a rushing upside quarterback like a Jaden Daniels or Anthony Richardson while you also use a Jamar Chase. But the next place I'll go with this is, okay, Burrow doesn't have a great GPP score. Jamar Chase does. But what if a second wide receiver in Cincinnati does? Or what if Mike Gesicki, also their new tight end, has a great GPP score? And now you say, all right, I want Chase in my lineup and I want Gesicki in my lineup. Well, if both of them are going to hit, there's a great chance that they pull Joe Burrow along with them. So that's when you then go to the quarterback with the not so great GPP score. So there are absolutely ways in which the GPP scores are going to help us immensely stacking wise, even though they are an individual player-based metric and we don't have stack-specific GPP scores. They'll still be really, really helpful. So again, this has been everything you need to know about the GPP scores. If you have further questions, which I'm sure many of you will, I will answer any DM about them. You can just drop them in the NFL channel too, because chances are if you have a question, somebody else is wondering the same thing. We will constantly have GPP score discussions in that channel, but hopefully this has been super helpful. At the end of the day, if you remember only one thing about the GPP scores, remember this: positive numbers are good, negative numbers are bad. It's not quite as simple as just building to maximize GPP score, but honestly, if you did that, you'd probably have success. And I think the success in PJ and MLB has been a testament to that. Hopefully NFL will be just as good. So thanks for tuning.